Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a political podcast where we're standing side by side, legs akimbo, because we think it makes us look cool. And I'm joined as usual by my friend Rob, and this time we're actually face to face. How are you, Rob?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very good. We're having a nice relaxing bank holiday weekend, aren't we?
Yeah, it's been lovely. The weather's been lovely. I always talk about the weather in this opening bit. I'm sorry, it's the most British thing I can think of, so I'm going to carry on.
So we're going to move straight on to Headline Quickfire. The Hands of History from the Times.
Yeah, so this is about the historic peace talks that happened between North and South Korea. I think these were, I don't know if you saw on the TV, Wilco, but these were amazing scenes. I thought it was just something that I never thought would happen in our lifetime.
Yeah, it seems like a very sudden change of policy. It's interesting. So I have a friend who's currently back in South Korea. He's South Korean and he's finally gone back there, I think, because now he can't get put into compulsory military service. But he's there for a few more months, and he was saying the opinion there on the ground is very much still like, we're not trusting this, but let's see where it goes.
Yeah.
But yeah, like as you say, no one expected that from the kind of rhetoric we had in January, February time.
Yeah, it's like nothing solid's come out of it yet, but sort of like it's a PR statement, and the sort of theatre around the whole thing was very impressive. You saw it's the first time that the leaders of the two countries ever met face to face, I think, since the countries split apart in 1945, and you know there were many scripted moments like Moon and Kim shaking on the South Korean side. Then there was sort of tension and unscripted moment as Kim took Moon back onto the North Korean side. But it seems quite a convivial relationship between the two. I know North Korea yesterday just moved their time zone to match South Korea's. So there are small little changes that are happening. We're going to have to see where this goes in the next couple of months, but it's something I never thought I'd ever see.
And I think there has been some speculation that their repeated nuclear testing in that mountainous region has actually... Their nuclear test site may be affected. There's been some Chinese geologists commenting on the seismic activity. So it may be that it could be multiple things, but there is some suspicion that they have essentially ruined their testing area, so they know they can't make any nukes and test them. So that would stop them from being able to kind of rattle their saber as they've been doing. Or it could be the fact that now that they have done some missile tests and made the rest of the world take notice, that then they're like, well, now we're on a stage where we like people won't come in and invade us because they know we have this as a threat. So it's kind of interesting. And the next headline, Rudd resigns, the Times.
This is the sort of conclusion to the Windrush scandal that we were talking about last time. There's a famous Alistair Campbell quote, I believe, that nobody can sustain up to 2 weeks in the headlines without eventually losing their job. And Rudd had exactly that. It was a scandal that would just not go away. And even though some interesting polling came out after the event that Amber Rudd resigned and lost her job, the polling stated that voters actually blamed Theresa May more for the immigration scandal than Rudd. But it's Rudd's head that has been on the chopping block, and it changes sort of the political complexion of her cabinet.
So the follow-up headline in The Guardian, Javid steps into the breach as PM tries to halt Windrush crisis.
Yeah, so the new Home Secretary is Javid, who is a BAME former son of a Rochdale bus driver. He's somebody who's sort of left field. Nobody considered that he would be available for this role, but people within the Conservative Party and outside seem to have been quite impressed by this appointment. Everybody sort of nodded their head and gone, oh yeah, I didn't think of him, but yeah, it seems like quite a sensible replacement. He's certainly untainted by the Windrush scandal appointment, like at all. There was speculation that Theresa May might have done an appointment from within and essentially recruit the person who was under Amber Rudd, the junior minister, into the position. But many people pointed out that wouldn't really solve the problem because she'd still be tainted by the same scandal. So Javid coming in sort of helped to calm things a little bit, even though he was He's a bit of a Remainer. He's a very soft Remainer, so it doesn't really solve Theresa May's problem within the cabinet of having a good balance between Remainers and Brexiteers. But he does seem to be well liked by those outside and seems like quite a sensible appointment.
And I'd just like to add on that, I think, when I saw it, I was like, oh, that's a shrewd move. He hasn't really had any scandal himself. He did get in a bit of a bit in the headlines last year about the steel workers, because he was what was the department? It's
I can't remember. I'm sorry.
Okay, I've forgotten the department off the top of my head, but he was involved in work and pensions or something like that.
Yeah.
But he's only really been involved in that one, and it was a bit of a scandal. But I think most people have forgotten about it now. And obviously, him being the son of an immigrant allows him. I think he may even be the first head of the Home Office to be the son of an immigrant and not just some white dude since Disraeli. So that's a long time. So they get to tick all the boxes of this is a good appointment. It shows we've taken everything on board, and I think it's essentially diffused the situation for them. Yeah. Next headline from the Daily Mail: House of Unelected Wreckers.
This is the Daily Mail, which supports the Brexiteer side of things. This was in response to the House of Lords essentially amending a clause that Parliament had tried to put through on the Brexit bill, stating that MPs should have a say in if the final Brexit deal that Theresa May gets between the UK and the EU will have to be approved by MPs. This is seen as controversial by Brexiteers because the House of Commons during the EU referendum and still now is pretty much sort of 70-30, I think, of people who would have campaigned to remain in the EU. So their big worry is that MPs might reject a deal, and even though the Conservatives and Labour both openly support a Brexit deal, that there are enough rebels on both sides, and Labour might see it in their interest to derail any Brexit deal that might be seen to sort of be a bad deal for workers as well. It just leaves a lot of risk for the government to lose one of the most important votes that there'll ever be in the House of Commons. So the Daily Mail has then taken their anger out at the House of Lords and is sort of starting to make a campaign to try and get the House of Lords elected to make sure that they can make sure this doesn't happen in the future, that vote doesn't get rejected.
I think it's interesting as someone who's pro-voting reform that, I would like to see the House of Lords, made an elected house for reasons of voting reform. But then the Daily Mail just seems to have been going, they've attacked the judges, they've attacked the Lords. The only person they haven't yet attacked this year, I feel, is the Queen. They seem to be going very against type in the kind of attacks they've been having because essentially Brexit is the most important thing to them at the moment. And they're kind of going down this enemies of the people route, which is a bit weird and worrying, I think, to be coming out of our mainstream media.
Yeah, it's just to add to that, it's... For the American listeners, it's this idea of the balance of power within the UK government. You've got separate institutions. The Lords and the judges being separate are meant to act as a check on any sort of... They're meant to act as a check on the legislature to make sure that if one party gets loads of power, that they can't just go and do whatever they want. It's the Lords that, Lords famously blocked the fox hunting renewal when Tony Blair was in power. Some would say that was an undemocratic thing to do, but they also could block some of the extreme terrorism legislation that was coming through. I believe it was the 80 days detention. They said, no, you've got to make it longer. So they acted as quite sort of a sensible limit on power. Here they might be seen to be quite sensible in limiting the power of Theresa May by making sure she's just not the only one to approve this Brexit deal and it goes through. They say no. The Lords would argue that it's more representative to have MPs voting on it. But we'll see what happens.
And our next headline from The Independent: tainted money in UK tax havens to be revealed.
So one of the big Conservative worries last general election is they were coming across as too lenient on UK tax havens, and that there's definitely a problem after Brexit that more people might try and put their money into these havens. So Theresa May is now looking to crack down on them and make sure that they sort of fall more in line with UK tax law.
And this is a bit of a backpedal, I think, from the Conservatives. It was previously, I think she made some statements, but nothing really happened. So this is actually, maybe they're actually going to do what they suggested they'd do a few years ago now. And another one from the Daily Mail. Show us your steel, Mrs. May.
So in the light of the House of Lords vote, this is a reaction to a letter sent by a group of about 60 backbench MPs, including everyone's favourite Brexiteer, Jacob Rees-Mogg, saying that they were worried about the current plans for the UK to, I think, to enter into a customs union in what they believe would be a form of soft Brexit. About 60 MPs have said that they don't want this to happen, that they would vote against Mrs. May if it happened. And with there being such a small majority that she commands in Parliament, she needs the support of these 60 MPs. So the Daily Mail telling her to show us steel, they actually are saying that she should that she should actually give in to these demands in a way, and that she should take more of a hard Brexit approach. She shouldn't get worried and go for a soft Brexit. She needs to double down, and then if we have the hard break, it's believed that more people will be supportive of Brexit rather than against it.
Our next headline is from the Metro. Bercow, out of order! Order!
So John Bercow is the Speaker of the House of Commons, and he's meant to be quite an independent role, and it's also meant to be a role that's free of any controversy. However, John Bercow has been brought into a scandal where he's been accused of bullying his personal secretary, and as the days have gone on, there seems to be another scandal that doesn't go away. Bercow's not particularly liked, at least in his own party, the Conservatives, so it might be another reason why the papers are picking on the scandal, because they want to get a speaker who's more sympathetic to the Conservatives, is one sort of possible theory. However, if obviously he has been bullying his personal secretary, this is a big scandal, and it would be likely that if that comes true, he should be replaced, and we'll find a new speaker soon enough.
And our final headline leading into our main story today, from the Financial Times, Labour chases capital gains as local elections test Tories.
Yeah, so this was a headline just done on the day before the local elections, suggesting that Labour was going to see big gains in London, where they'd seen strong support in early polling. As it turned out, things didn't quite turn out the way Labour hoped, but we'll move on to discuss that in our main story of the local elections 2018.
I think probably the best thing to do here is start with the overall result and then go from there. So would you like to fill everyone in on how everything went? It's kind of seen as a test, isn't it, for the major parties, and essentially, like we've been talking about the polling in recent weeks, it's a way to see how the country feels with an actual vote without it being an actual general election, because our general election is now 4 years away.
Yeah, elections are the ultimate opinion poll, I always think, because you get to have your widest sample size and you get to see how people really feel about the parties. Overall, the results were probably a little disappointing for Labour, who had expected to see big gains in the capital. Those didn't really materialise. However, the Conservatives also found themselves losing ground in a lot of places as well. The big takeaway, I think, is that we're at a stage in politics where voters have accepted the status quo. There are two very big political parties who are unable to make ground on the other in their heartlands. And the BBC extrapolated the votes from the latest election and said that if a general election was held today, they think that Labour would be the biggest party, but by only 6 seats, and neither Labour nor the Conservatives would be anywhere close to forming a majority government. Which maybe shows a new era of British politics where we just get used to coalition governments or minority governments. They may have to be the norm. Yeah,
so I think one thing is, of course, both of the main parties, so they were both on 35% of the vote share each, basically neck and neck. The projection, as you say, showed that Labour would have slightly more seats in the House of Commons, but not enough to form an overall majority. But there's been, both parties have essentially claimed it as a success and said that the other party has failed. So there was a lot of expectation for Labour to do well in certain seats. They were hoping to take some Tory seats in the centre of London, but those seats have been Tory for a very long time. So the fact that they didn't take them and got a few extra councillors is still quite good. It's just that their expectation was built up massively before this vote. So there's a lot of talk saying they should have done better, and I think this has been thrown at the Conservatives as well, so that there's a back and forth, as there always is. Basically, both of them can claim victory in different ways, and that's kind of interesting to watch, because I think both people, the average person would probably say neither party has particularly got what it wanted.
Yeah, that's fair. I think Labour should be massively proud of what they've been able to do in London. Their biggest failure was not being able to control the hype train, as it were, or the big sort of push that Momentum had. The lines coming out of the Conservative chairman the day after the local election, he was bigging up. He was saying Sadiq Khan said that they were going to turn all of London red, and there would be no safe haven for Conservatives anymore. And that was proven not to be the case. However, Labour came very, very close to winning two important councils. I think Wadsworth there was analysis done there saying that they were about 50 votes short, or if 50 people had voted differently, then they would have gone from getting overall control of that council rather than being two councillors short, as it was in the end. Labour also had big wins outside of London as well. They won back Plymouth, that had previously gone Conservative in 2014, and they won back Trafford in Manchester, which had been a little blue corner of Manchester that the Conservatives were quite proud of, because the Conservatives used to boast of that, saying that this is proof we can appeal to working class voters. Now that's gone, it appears that Labour has strengthened its support in the cities.
But then equally, I think it was in Barnet where the Conservatives won, and then they were able to use that as, because it's a very Jewish area, they were able to use that as an example of the anti-Semitism row affecting Labour, and bring that up again so it gets back in the news to attack back at Labour.
Yeah, certainly. That's another weakness that the Labour Party has had, and another story that's been dominating our coverage and political coverage in general is Labour's perceived failure to deal with anti-Semitism within the party. And yeah, we're now seeing that come true at the ballot box, and that was what Labour's biggest fear was, I think, this general election. A small point to talk about these results when we're talking about Labour's success or failure is that these were seats that were last contested in 2014 when Ed Miliband was leader, and it was a very successful night that in 2014. They took a lot of seats off the Conservatives, which is what you'd expect when the Conservatives have been in power for quite some time. So Labour didn't actually have much further that they could go up. They'd already won so many councils, it's hard to improve on your high watermark. So the fact that they were able to win some councils back, it still shows a very impressive night for Labour. And I think if you compare it with the relatively disastrous local election results that happened in 2017, I don't know if you remember, Wilco, but about a month before the general election, the Conservatives thrashed Labour in the 2017 locals. People said it was a disaster for Jeremy Corbyn. I think they got 28% of the vote and the Conservatives got 40%. Now the political landscape is very different. We know that Jeremy Corbyn's been a success in the general elections, where he's able to persuade a huge amount of new voters to come to the Labour Party. And now that their vote share is equal, the Conservatives over the local elections should also be seen as a good sign.
And I think talking about getting younger voters in, this is interesting because local elections tend to have less young voters. So, I mean, this obviously isn't true of everyone, but a lot of people go off to university, and when they're at university, they might not bother to register themselves to vote every year. So for local elections, you tend to miss out on that vote because people feel like it doesn't really affect me, or they might be voting at home with their parents. So I think there's that, but also, I mean, like the turnout for this election is something like 10% less than the general election, I think, about that amount. And there's definitely a lower turnout with younger voters. So for Labour to be doing this well with a slightly older group of voters, considering they tend to have more younger voters supporting them, is also interesting. Yeah. And I think before we move on from the two main parties, I think it's just worth pointing out that UKIP's vote completely collapsed. And I wonder if what kind of trends have we seen with those people returning to their previous voting habits, and how has that affected the vote for both the Tories and Labour.
Yeah, I think that the collapse of UKIP certainly masked what would have been Conservative failings. Had UKIP been able to retain the amount of support that they got in 2014, it would have been an absolutely disastrous night for the Conservatives. However, I think we've seen that those UKIP, those people who previously voted for UKIP councillors have gone back to being Conservative voters in the main. There hasn't been a great split between... I think we saw in the general election that some areas which voted very strongly for Brexit either went back to their traditional roots of voting Labour or Conservative, depending on where in the country they were. But it appears nearly universally that UKIP voters have gone back to the Conservative Party. Their vote collapsing from losing 123 councillors on the night, only retaining 3. And I don't know if you heard the UKIP leader on Radio 4 and his comments.
Was this the one about the Black Death?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A comment so shocking that it made Nick Robinson go, "I'm sorry, did you just say the Black Death?" And then stating that despite being a disease that wiped out over 7 million people, it also brought about great economic prosperity afterwards and the Renaissance. So I don't really think I need to add to that comment. I think that shows you exactly where the UKIP are as a political party right now.
Yeah, clearly some misunderstanding of cause and effect there. But yeah, I think it's just worth mentioning because besides the fact that they've lost so many seats, there's not really much more to say on UKIP now. And I think we can probably carry on without mentioning them again because as we've said previously, with Brexit achieved, what's the point of UKIP? I mean, you will occasionally get people like Nigel Farage coming up and spouting stuff, but I think realistically, they've done what they said they were going to do, and so no one wants to vote for them anymore.
Yeah, UKIP have won. As in, both main political parties that were formerly Remain now support leaving the EU. So with that in place, what is the point of UKIP anymore? So
talking about Remain, the Lib Dems have been on a very strong "we must remain in the EU" platform, and how have they done in these local elections? So the Lib Dems have done quite well for themselves. They've recovered on where they were. Again, we mentioned 2014 being the last time these seats were up for grabs. In 2014, the Lib Dems were in coalition with the Conservatives, and as a result, their councillors took a hit for that. Usually being in power means that people will protest vote against your party. So this was always going to be seen by the Lib Dems as a potential night to gain voters back. But also, like we mentioned, they're the only one of the big 3 parties that still supports a Remain position. And I think that had a big effect, particularly in strong Remain areas of London, such as Richmond-on-Thames. Which is your local constituency? No, my local constituency is Kingston-upon-Thames.
Kingston-upon-Thames.
But that has also swung back to the Lib Dems. And I think well, we said we'd talk about local areas maybe a bit later. But the bottom west region, southwest region of London is now very yellow. So Sutton has been yellow for some time, and with both Kingston-upon-Thames and Richmond-on-Thames going back to Lib Dem, after I think about 8 years now, or maybe 4 years, I can't remember, but yes, they've both gone back to Lib Dem. So I think it's they're not quite getting the vote share they were used to in local elections before 2010, but they are starting to regain their kind of traditional strongholds.
Yeah, things are looking up for the Lib Dems, but watch this space. We'll see if. As always with the Lib Dems, I think that their time will come if a Brexit deal comes and both big parties vote on it and it proved to be unpopular with the main population. That's where they could see their real gains come back.
Okay, so we briefly touched on our constituencies just then. Were you? How did your constituency vote? Were you surprised, or was this kind of what you expected in your area?
In my local constituency, we didn't have elections. We were out in the southwest. We were left unaffected by it. I can't remember when our last elections were. I think it might have actually been 2017. So we've got another 3 years to wait. But it's nice to look from the outside on this.
Fair enough. So as we've already mentioned, my constituency was Kingston-upon-Thames. This was traditionally a Lib Dem area, and we traditionally had a Lib Dem MP. And then in 2015, 2014, I think they voted in the Tory council. So I think there's Southwest London, quite middle class. There tends to be very little Labour vote there, so it's very much Conservative versus Lib Dem. Labour still puts up someone to be a councillor, but they tend not to do very well on the vote. I don't think most of the students in the area vote in our local elections. I think that might be part of it. It's kind of interesting to try and pick apart. So I think there was an expectation for a swing to the Lib Dems, so we're not that surprised that the Lib Dems won both those seats. Richmond was very close, I think. I can't remember the exact vote share. Kingston upon Thames was surprisingly not close. We ended up with 39 Lib Dems to 9 Tories. Considering, so that's a big swing. So I think there's probably some students voting who would be pro-Remain. There will be locals obviously pro-Remain who are voting for that reason. But the two big reasons, I think, one, there's been a scandal locally with the Tories basically saying we're going to increase your council tax by 8%, I think, which is above the, I think it's 3% is like the maximum you can do without asking, and they didn't have a vote on it. So they just said we're going to put it up by 8%. Everyone complained and said you have to have a vote on it. But by then they couldn't have the vote, so they had to put it up by the minimum increase. So that was kind of big, and I think in everyone's minds last year. So I think that's probably stayed with people. And the other thing is, if I'm honest, the first piece of Conservative electioneering I saw, and I suppose electioneering is not even the right term here, the first time I've seen any blue advert in the last few months was when I saw one of the potential councillors standing outside the polling station with their blue rosette, which is the only thing they're allowed to do at the polling station. So I think it's obvious that they just weren't trying in our area. So we've had 6 to 7 different Lib Dem pamphlets through over the last few weeks. Every single person in the House got a personal in inverted commas letter written by Sir Ed Davey, who's our MP. So it was he clearly written out by hand, then photocopied and sent to everyone with the right name on. So that's, looks like a personal touch. Kind of funny when all three of you get one because you realise it's not so personal, but you can see they were really trying for a push in these areas, and it's paid off. They've regained what they traditionally had.
Yeah, I think that shows that the Lib Dems are returning to their old campaigning style that they had under Charles Kennedy, which was to build up these Lib Dem fortresses, as they used to call them. So the idea of this is that the Lib Dems as a third party in British politics have to operate a little differently than the two main parties who can generally guarantee some support from everywhere. The Lib Dems have to go very strong on local issues, and they tend to build up a good foundation of support by having good local services and making sure that when people come to national elections that they remember what the Lib Dems have done for them all throughout the year. They kind of value their voters quite a lot where they've got them, because they realise that it would only take, if we look back to the results of 2015 where they lost so many areas, that was a result of them being in national government and people punishing them for that. So they feel that they have to build up these good local connections again and regain that trust. So like you said, no other party, to my knowledge, does these personally signatured letters. That's a thing that the Lib Dems are still very big on and will continue to do. The personal touch, making it sure you could vote for a big party. It's almost like, you could go to Amazon, but they don't really care about you. We're our local shop. We understand your issues and we listen to you. And that's how they build up these sort of fortresses of support.
Local elections for local people.
So that's really interesting to see that kind of national strategy, as I think it was, sort of come to fruition, and you see it personally, and it kind of, as you said, it definitely worked in this instance. It's not just on a national issue of Brexit. I worked in local government for a small time, and they said that the national picture doesn't always matter as long as your bins get collected on time, you fill in potholes, and you have gritter bins. That's what can lead you to local election success.
In the lead up to the general election, we still managed to get rid of the previous Tory MP because I think he'd been a bit useless. Again, on local issues, he hadn't really achieved anything until the run up to the general election, when he sent out a letter being like, I know there's terrible congestion at the station and we should sort that. And I feel a lot of people that was too little too late, and he was using his office as MP to try and get himself re-elected. It was definitely wasn't so sure in the run up to the general election last year because I can tell you there were a lot of Conservative placards, on the other side of the street from us, We lived on a pretty interesting street where our side was kind of all either old mansion flats or old houses that have been turned into a load of flats. So it's very, some older people living there, but in general, younger families, new families are living there. And then the other side of the street, or slightly further away, is all kind of mansions that are, you can see that would be the section that would tend to vote more Conservative. But I didn't see any kind of placards up around there this year. So it is interesting that I feel like they just weren't paying attention to the local elections. So another thing that was happening in this local elections was there was an ID trial. So voters now need to have certain types of ID in order to vote, or at least that's the plan. So this was trialled in, I think, five council elections. So I think one was a mayoral election and the others were like London boroughs and some areas around the country. And I think, Watford, one of the places, there's an article saying that there was... that this trial was preventing people from voting, but then I think there's been some people have been disputing the figure because it sounded like 1 in 5 people weren't allowed to vote, and it sounds like it was a lot less than that. But that's kind of a change from how we've done voting in this country. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I heard that the government was saying, oh no, this has had little to no impact on voter turnout, particularly those on the left would suggest that this matter is one that forcing people to have ID with them purposely targets lower working class voters, people who are less likely to have a formal form of ID on them, and stops them going to the polling station to vote. So they would argue that it's something that actually works in the Conservatives' favour. I think the actual figures I heard was that this is from a tweet from Ed Miliband on the issue, that I'll try and find and add to the show notes, said that it affected about 1.9% of people were being turned away in a certain constituency, which is still quite a few, and in local elections where they can really go down to the wire, where you can have like single figure digits deciding if a council is elected or not, that can have a huge impact. The reason that ID trials were brought in was trying to stop fraudulent voting, but the argument against it is that this is a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut, that forcing this level ID is actually stopping people who would never be fraudulent voters from going to the polls. So, yeah, in general, I think I'm glad it's been trialled on a local scale. I think it would be far more controversial if it was done in a general election. I don't want to see it stick. If I'm giving this is my personal opinion here, I do think that it will turn people away from voting. It'll have more of a degree of worry when you go to the polls. What ID have I got? Is there a chance that I won't be able to have my democratic say? And if that affects turnout on local elections and brings it down, I think that's generally like a bad thing for democracy. I don't know if you got anything to have a look at.
I mean, yeah, so I think it's worth mentioning here potentially for American listeners. There have been issues with voter ID laws in the US. And while I think the argument in principle is the same, we don't have the same kind of issues at the moment so the problem in the States, for example, is it's often black voters who they need like their driving license. So go somewhere like the DMV. DMV's only open at lunchtime. They can't leave their job at lunchtime because they don't have an office job if they're in poorer areas. So that's kind of the problem there, is that it very much seems to be systematically against Democrat voters in the US. I think it's less of a problem here because I'd assume most people have a form of ID. Maybe that's a flaw on my part. Maybe this is more of a problem than I think it is. But I mean, I 100% agree with you. I don't think we need this. I think it's a bad idea, and I think it will stop some people from voting, and that is bad. So I just think it's less clear. It was definitely less clear in the run-up to this trial how bad it would be. And I agree, 1%, especially in local elections, can really swing the votes one way or the other. I mean, some seats, I think it was like 40 votes won it. So definitely a concern. But I think it's not quite as clear-cut maybe as it was in the States, where it seems like they are definitely penalising Democrat voters. That being said, it is nice just to be able to turn up with nothing. I have a Polish colleague who is used to Polish elections where they do have voter ID, and he went to vote in the local elections, and he was like, "It's crazy! I didn't need any ID." Like, because his expectation is he will need ID. But yes, I think in general it will turn away a small percentage of voters who either don't have access to ID, forget to bring ID, and I think in some places there was some confusion over which types of ID were allowed, because there's a minimum set, like driving license, passport, but then various councils said, "Oh, you can also use this council-issued document," and that made for some confusion, and a few people were turned away because they turned up with a form of ID, but it wasn't on the list in their area, So I think there's definitely problems there, and I think it's just a waste of time. We'd be much better focusing on general voting reform, like the alternative vote. So we've discussed the local elections. We've kind of jumped into some of the detail, I think. Would you like just to give us a kind of overall summary there, Rob?
Yeah, so I think overall, as I mentioned, Labour lost the spin war before this. They sort of hyped up their chances in London. It would have been a great victory for them if they'd been able to consolidate those victories. As it is, it was a bit of a damp squib, but Labour shouldn't be deterred by the results. It's still a very good showing, shows that Corbyn is as popular as ever. The one concern that I think Labour should have is that they were unable to make any ground in key swing vote areas, and it might show that Corbyn has a very good appeal within cities but a limited appeal outside of them. And if you were unable to have a popularity amongst the whole country, both in urban and country areas, then you won't be able to be Prime Minister. As the poll showed, that Labour will not be able to form a majority government at the next election if they do a similar performance there. So that's the one worry from Labour. For the Conservatives, it wasn't as bad a night as they thought. That's the only thing that they can take away from this, and it probably secured Theresa May's position a little bit more. The worry before this for the Conservatives was that she would do so badly that there might be talk again of her losing her leadership. I don't think that's on the cards now. For the Lib Dems, it was a night of consolidation, slowly regaining the gains that they had before, and I think they probably will start to see that happen again in the next round of local elections. I think things can only get better for the Lib Dems in the short term, but we'll see what happens as a result of the Brexit deal. And finally, ding dong, UKIP's dead. And I think we can, that'll be the last that we'll hear of them.
Okay, we're not going to do a quick polls update this week because essentially that's all we've been discussing, and this was, more informative than a poll would be. We also don't have a kind of would you rather or some other regular segment, so I think I'm just going to throw a short question to Rob, a bit lighter than usual, just to end out the episode. What's your thought of the Tory power stance?
I'm a big fan of how ridiculous it is. I love the fact that there's a man somewhere or somebody who said, yes, this is what you should do to make yourself look cool, and it really doesn't. Both the BBC and The Guardian have run very good articles this week on the origin of the Tory power stance, and my personal favourite is George Osborne. I don't know if you've seen that at all. It's a man with kind of his knees are together, but then he splays out his legs from the knees to the bottom, which is the most unnatural stance possible. It's like somebody's whispered into his ear, like, yes, this is how the humans stand. You should do it like this. So it's ridiculous. I saw councillors, I think it was the Swindon councillors. There was a photo on Twitter of all the Swindon Tory councillors doing a very big leg slide. So I think the Conservatives are now kind of turning it into a comedy strength for them. They're doubling, again, they know that people are doing it, and they appear to be doubling down on it and making it more of a joke and lighthearted. I think it's silly and you shouldn't do it, but that's just me.
I definitely think my favourite comparison was a photo of, I think it was, there's a shot of Theresa May and another member of the cabinet and Javid doing it. And then underneath them is a photo from Blackadder the Third, where it's all of the Prince George and his flunkies doing it, looking like complete idiots. So I think that probably sums up how stupid it looks. I'll try and find that to put in the show notes. So Rob, I've really enjoyed having you here in person to record for once. We should do this more often. And is there any parting thoughts you have?
I really enjoyed it. I really enjoy elections. elections are the best things to talk about because you've actually got the most data and stuff to talk. There's the most interesting things come out of elections. So yeah, I'm looking forward to the next election episode.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, having some hard numbers instead of just guessing what this might mean to the electorate is always good. If you've enjoyed this episode, please go and rate us up on iTunes. It's how more people will find us. Go and give us a good rating. Tell everyone about the podcast. We're really enjoying doing this, and we're going to keep on doing these kind of episodes up until summer, when during silly season our plan is to do a series of kind of in-depth episodes on different parts of how politics in the UK works. So we're going to be thinking on those. Those are going to be different style of episodes, but just if you have any suggestions, we'd love to see comments on Reddit, on the Facebook page, or on Twitter, where you can follow us at Unparl Podcast. On Reddit, we're /r/unparliamentary. And you can also find us at Patreon, where any money you can give towards the cost of running the website and keeping us going, and maybe so Rob can get a decent microphone for when he's not in person. That'd be great. And that's at patreon.com/TTSS. So I think it's good night from me.
And it's good night for him.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. You can see me waving into the microphone now, as I always do at my house at home. Bye.